Alright, everybody, it is I, obviously Jesus, your favorite fucking used car salesman up in this winch, here to tell y'all fucks and cucks about the second Patreon video for the month of July 2019. Today, we're going to be spending a little bit of time. Hopefully, I'm going to try to make this a short video, but I always say that and it always winds up being 30 or more minutes. But yeah, today I want to talk about reparations, the idea of reparations, because it's something that has been getting a lot of, or not a lot, but a lot more coverage than it ever has been before in the media and in the presidential field. I don't know that there was any questions asked or were any questions asked about it at the debate specifically, but actually, I think it did get a mention. I'm honestly not sure, but it's not really relevant. But the presidential candidates have been, fielding the question, if not on the debate stage, then elsewhere, quite a bit. And reparations is something that's always, been sort of a weird topic to me because I never really considered it as realistic. Although I have to admit that it's because I had a fundamental misunderstanding of it. I really didn't understand how it would be accomplished and how it would be administered, because I always thought that reparations would be focused on somehow redistributing the wealth of white people whose ancestors owned slaves and individuals and corporations, and redistributing their wealth directly to the descendants of the people that they enslaved. And to me, that idea seemed like a totally unenforceable thing. That seemed like what people, I'm not sure entirely where I got this impression, honestly, but that seemed like what people wanted to do, and it just seemed like a totally unenforceable, unaccomplishable thing, as it would require so much legal back and forth, and most people likely could not afford. It would also leave out people, or descendants of people who could not prove their family's history due to, either destroyed documents or other forms of bad record keeping. So some people would seemingly be left out if they somehow could not prove that they are the descendants of enslaved people. So it always seemed a little bit weird to me that people thought that this was a serious issue, because I always thought that it could not be accomplished due to the logistical concerns, if nothing else. It also seemed to actively punish, I at some point thought, the descendants of slave owners who, as people living in this time, have done nothing with regard to slavery in their lifetime, of course. All white people certainly benefit in a residual way from the practice of slavery. That's part of white privilege. It's not, saying that you did anything or that you have anything to feel guilty about that you specifically have done as a white person, but the black community started at, well behind because of slavery, so it is part of white privilege to say that we benefit residually from slavery, although certainly I wouldn't advocate for anything that would say that modern day people are responsible for slavery that happened hundreds of years ago. But anyway, I read up on the topic recently, and I was thankfully able to become a bit more educated on what reparations might actually look like if they were implemented, which is knowledge I'd like to share because, for all I know, even though, especially as a younger person, I was fairly, tuned in and educated and, knew a lot of things, this is something that's had totally escaped my sphere, my sphere of knowledge, and I wanted to share this, new knowledge with you guys today and give my opinions and thoughts on whether or not this might actually be practical, and whether or not I think it is a moral thing. And I do think it is, spoiler alert, I do think that there is a moral justification, certainly, for some kind of reparations in some form, because, like I said, the idea that white people and black people were on equal footing when slavery ended is, I don't think any sane human being would argue that, except maybe that white pride Andrew. If you forgot, this is also what prompted me to think about this again in some sense, because for those of you who don't remember, or who didn't watch, on my main gaming channel, or my former gaming channel, I made a video months back, possibly even years at this point, of me playing Fortnite, and we had 3 people, and we did a squad fill with this guy, and he just got randomly match made into us. Of course, we didn't seek him out or anything, but 2 of my friends and I wound up in a squad with a guy who went by the name of White Pride Andrew, and he proceeded to, among many other disgusting things, say that black people, once emancipated, bitched and wanted reparations, and as if they were expected to just somehow pull themselves up by their bootstraps after literally having been enslaved and still having an age of fucking ages and ages to go before they truly got full civil rights, and they still, of course, face problems today. So yeah, I don't know that anybody except fucking insane alt-right fucking neo-Nazi motherfuckers like White Pride Andrew would argue that black people were on the equal footing with white people when they got emancipated legally. But yeah, I think it's almost undeniable to most people that black people were at a severe disadvantage even after gaining their legal freedom, and that didn't even happen immediately at all. And that's part of what I understand is a holiday called Juneteenth, when slaves who had continued to work and be enslaved after the Emancipation Proclamation were finally told that they were free. So, there's a lot of stuff out there that is arguable about reparations and the specific logistics of it, but I don't think you can argue the premise that black people were disadvantaged even after being emancipated. So I think that some form, if you accept that, I think that you should also have to accept that some form of reparations may be necessary to account for that. The premise of reparations in general is something that has always made a lot of sense to me. It's simply been logistics that I thought made it impossible. Even though black people, when they were emancipated, were allegedly compensated with 40 acres and a mule, as you might have heard on a Kendrick album or something, as the saying goes, and that was later revoked by Andrew Johnson, freed slaves were still massively disadvantaged following the Civil War. And keep in mind that while the Emancipation Proclamation took effect at the beginning of 1863, black people had to work until, like I said, the 1960s to get their rights and truly be free in what may be considered anything resembling the American, or the way that American whites have always felt free. And that doesn't even really factor in the discrimination that they still face on a personal and more subtle institutional basis that continues to this very day. Although maybe subtle isn't the right word, because being killed by cops and incarcerated far more than white people isn't exactly subtle. And honestly, the prison system isn't even really a far cry from modern slavery. It is essentially modern slavery in many aspects. You're essentially being paid slave wages, and slavery is, as I talked about in a previous video, still not outlawed for incarcerated people. And that is, again, something that is extremely worrisome about this country, that we treat prisoners that way and we treat incarcerated people that way, and we have a system involving private prisons and mandatory minimums, and Republican lawmakers and some centrist Democrat lawmakers like fucking 1980s Joe Biden, who have worked to create a system that essentially amounts to modern slavery. So at least on paper, African Americans now have all the same rights as everybody else, and that took them a long time to get to, but they still face stuff today. So the idea that African Americans have ever, even now, been on equal footing with white people is a little bit laughable to me, and that goes for other minorities as well. Certainly, we may wind up owing stuff to the poor immigrant families and the children who are in cages right now, because, and just as an aside here, I wanted to say this, I don't know if I wanted to tweet it or whatever, what is it going to take for people to come out and call Donald Trump a Nazi? Republicans won't even call him a racist at this point. What is it going to take for people to call him a Nazi? A fucking German publication, one of their most popular national magazines, posted Donald Trump doing the Hitler salute over this past week. And they are fucking Germans, and they don't take that shit lightly. What is it going to take for centrists and Republicans to actually come out and say Donald Trump has Nazi and fascist tendencies? I mean, the concentration camps didn't help, or it didn't help that cause of getting them to disavow him at the very least. What is it going to take for him to actually be called what he is, or be at the very least labeled, for where his tendencies fit in the tapestry of history? It's like people are waiting for Donald Trump to come out and say, "Oh yeah, I love Hitler. Hitler's great," and he's never going to say that because he doesn't like Hitler. I'm sure he thinks he is the opposite of Hitler. Doesn't see any similarities, even though everybody else outside his little sphere of influence certainly does. It's crazy to me that people are not more up in arms. I mean, I guess they're probably experiencing, even on the left, the same things that I do. Like, what the fuck can I possibly do besides, like, I don't have a gun. I can't physically, fight ICE. I mean, I could fight maybe a fucking recovering ICE agent who sprained his ankle or something. I could fight one of those guys, maybe, those fucking Nazi bastards, but like, I don't know. But yeah, this is just an aside. I do want to say, though, I think America will certainly wind up owing some form of reparations to people who have been affected by this our treatment of migrants, both under the Obama administration and now certainly under the Trump administration. But yeah, so minorities in this country have always gotten an unfair shake, but probably none more than African Americans, who were brought here and enslaved for ages and ages from the inception of America as the 13 colonies. So it is also indisputable to say that, had slaves been given wealth equal to the labor they and their families put in during their time in slavery, rather than, this 40 acres and a mule that they didn't even get to keep. The current day descendants of those freed men would certainly control more wealth in this country than they do now, and would have been better equipped to counter later problems like discrimination and segregation. Money moves the world, America in particular, so not having money is about the plainest disadvantage one can have in this country, and no doubt contributed to some of the problems we see in the inner city and cycles of poverty that we see today in African American and other minority communities, although it's certainly far from the only factor that affects, ghettoization and poverty, which is all unfortunate in all its forms. Although I will say that there is a sort of drawback in coming at it from this angle. This does run the risk of trying to legislate something real based on a hypothetical alternate universe in which, in this case, African American freed slaves were paid a certain amount for their labor, and that would be hard to calculate, and it would be hard to really, there's no real way to, say, oh, well, they would have had the X, Y, and Z had, A, B, and C been different. There's no real direct causal way, so it has to be a little bit more approximate than anything concrete, and it does set a sort of bad precedent, for legislating something based on our approximation of an alternate universe where things might have gone better. But surely it's inarguable that they would have been at least somewhat better off had the government treated them better earlier and fairly compensated for all their slave labor and given them more than 40 acres and a mule that they couldn't keep. So there is, in general, a validity to this concept, although how to turn it into actual legislation is a little bit of a mystery to me, although this is only one point among many. So the idea is valid, certainly, but I think a stronger argument is what I talked about earlier, that people were not compensated. They did not get to keep even the paltry sum America gave them, and thus, considering the discrimination they faced even after slavery, there is some basis for giving them some amount of money. The main counter argument, I think, to reparations has always been the idea that it punishes people who did not perpetrate slavery, and in fact, if we paid it through taxes, which I'll talk about in just a second, it would tax the descendants of white abolitionists as well as the people whose ancestors owned slaves. So they would essentially be taxing everybody equally, regardless of what side of history their ancestors were on, which in some sense, in terms of holding specific people accountable and targeting specific areas of wealth, would sort of seem to defeat the purpose of reparations if you are not taking money from those who own slaves to and giving it to the people who are descended from slaves. But in another sense, in the sense that it will hopefully close the gap, which is the more important thing, I would say, the more important outcome rather than the high-minded idea behind it. The more important thing is that it will close the gap somewhat between African Americans and white Americans and sort of give them, it can never truly, centuries of still having to fight and be discriminated against can never truly be repaid in a strictly monetary sense, of course, but it can go some way to repairing that gap, I think, between white and black Americans and offset some of the damage that was caused by slavery and the absolutely horrendous poor treatment of America or African Americans during Reconstruction. So I certainly do have to see that accomplishing this through taxes is going to, wind up, it's going to certainly tax everybody who is alive today who has never owned a slave and certainly would not support owning slaves. And it's also going to tax the descendants of people on both sides of the issue, both people whose ancestors supported and opposed the practice of slavery. But I think that this is the best way to go about it. If taxes were used less in other areas, if we lowered taxes in other areas, or we used tax money for less stuff in areas that we could certainly cut back on, like defense spending, we could tax people the same level and just give people reparations money instead of wasting it on fucking fighter jets and shit. It certainly doesn't address the moral issue, but it would at least not raise taxes on anyone regardless of their ancestry, and it would solve the problem while not hurting people in the wallet, which I think most people would get on board for. And you might be wondering, why pay reparations out of taxes? Why not target specific people and specific corporations? And I think we could do that to some degree with extremely wealthy individuals and corporations. But we certainly, if you're a poor white person whose ancestors owned slaves, you've never owned slaves yourself. Your life doesn't deserve to be much worse. You don't deserve to be specifically targeted in the modern day, just on a very specific level, if it's going to make your life so much worse, even, just because your ancestors did something. So I think having it come from a community pool of taxes would improve the optics and the feel of paying reparations for white people and the morality of the situation, in a sense, by shifting the onus from any individual people or corporations even who benefit from slave wealth to this day, shifting that responsibility, in a sense, to the general population of America. And in some sense, we could all get together as a country, as a nation, where none of us have this history ourselves as individuals, but we do have to reckon with this history as a country. And it's not like it's something that happened and is over now. It's something that we still benefit from as white people residually today. So the ability to get together and participate in a real atonement, not for our sins, but for America's sins, I think it might be one of the more palatable options. Because while we can all acknowledge that we are innocent of slavery in the modern day, we benefit from it, but we are innocent of the practice. America, as an institution that has existed since 1776 and before as the colonies, America is not innocent. So to do it as an American thing, I think might even be considered by many people patriotic, and I think it would catch on with more people than one might imagine. In a sense, it would allow people to effectively, in a real way, pay against their privilege and try to offset it in that way. And hopefully in a way that would ultimately not cost them more in any taxes. So it would be painless, and we could shift the use of tax money from something else to something productive and something healing and something that would offset the real practical damage that America's treatment of African Americans and African slaves has caused, and that is still felt today in those communities. It would not need to be a permanent thing as well. This is not something that I think would have to continue forever, although the actual process of determining how much and how long money is to be repaid to these folks would be its own thing. It's not something I have any specifics on, and it's frankly above my pay grade, but I do think it's a worthwhile thing to proceed with. And it's also important to remember that there are precedents in American history for this. I forget whose administration it was, but reparations were paid to Japanese people and Japanese American folks who were in the internment camps in World War II and their families. So there is definitely historical precedent for reparations. And, slavery, as horrible as the internment camps were, and like I said, I do think we'll be winding up paying these poor migrant families at some point for their pain and suffering, because these are essentially internment camps as well that we have on their border right now in this fucking country in the year 2019. But like with the internment camps and these border camps right now, as horrible and terrible as they are, they still are, less severe than hundreds of years of slavery. So the idea that we would pay, the Japanese internment camp victims as well, and not pay the descendants of African-American slaves, or African slaves, I guess. I don't know what the proper term is. I don't know when they precisely became African-American in the black view, so I hope I'm not offending anybody. But yeah, the idea that we would, compensate internment camp victims rather and not do anything, even the slightest little bit on slavery, even though it has been some time, or a decent amount of time. The idea that we wouldn't do that in some way, or that it's not worth doing or not worth going through the hassle of doing, is a bit of a ludicrous idea to me. I still don't know exactly how they tackle the problem of determining who, was owned, whose ancestors were owned as slaves, and how you would prove that, and how you would make a claim for that in the court. I do think that you still run the risk of leaving out people whose, ancestry has been lost to, bad record keeping or destroyed records or something like that. But I do think it's better to do something than nothing. And what I do know is that black people are demonstrably still suffering in residual ways as a result of what effectively amounts to their delayed start in America. And some gesture, I don't know precisely in what amount or for how long, like I said, but some gesture, even a small one to start, would be a good beginning to the process of rectifying and reckoning with our history. So yeah, I'm obviously Jesus. That's been the video. Your music recommendation for the week is the entire discography of a band called Gym Shorts from my home state of Rhode Island. They are fucking awesome. I saw them the other night opening for Ammo and the Sniffers. Their discography, Gym Shorts that is pretty small. You can listen to it in like an hour and change. So you may enjoy that if you so desire. I will see you guys next week. And then the fourth video, I did say I didn't want to do this, but it's going to probably wind up having to come to it. I didn't want to do a debate video, but the 2 nights of debates at the end of this month will be released in a video on the night of the 31st, or the very, very morning of the 1st of August. That'll be the 4th and final video for July. But yeah, I don't know what I'm doing next week. As always, suggestions are more than welcome and definitely desired at this point in time. So I'm obviously Jesus. Thanks for watching. See you fucks and cucks later.